Destiny's crossroads.
What will we find on the other side?
Freedom. Boundless, terrifying freedom. Like a great, never-ending sky.
Hello, Internet. I'm Jackie Fox, and I'd like for you to join me in a thought experiment. Imagine an ideal world. What do you see? How do you know it's ideal? If you're anything like me, you're imagining a world without homelessness or hunger, where the life expectancy increases along with quality of life. Everyone has access to health care, our world is healthy, and our ecosystem isn't on the verge of collapse. Following the logic of capitalism, though, you'd really just want a strong stock market and around 3% market growth per year. Everything else is just icing on the cake.
What the hell did I just see?
A glimpse of tomorrow if we fail here today.
This can't be our future.
The problem is that while these two sets of goals aren't entirely mutually exclusive, focusing entirely on market wealth over individual health and outcomes seems to make many of the goals of my idealized world much more difficult. Even more difficult would be maintaining these freedoms in an economic system that prefers everything to be privatized and sold for the highest price the market can support. This can often mean that the market that's supposed to make everything more efficient may use things like planned obsolescence or artificial scarcity to make the products you consume either lower quality or higher cost than they really could or should be, just to maximize profits. Capitalism probably isn't the worst system in theory. A lot of the basic market principles extolled by capitalists make sense, but the problem is that humans are adept at breaking or gaming systems to maximize rewards. When the system is capitalism, the reward maximized will generally be profit, even if this comes to the cost of human health or the environment. We have seen this acutely in the US over the last year as stock markets soared, even while a record amount of the US suffered the ravages of being unemployed during a pandemic. Wouldn't we all be better off if the variable we used to cheat the system maximized human happiness or quality of life? Capitalists might say that capitalism is such a system, noting the various ways life has improved since trading feudalism for capitalism, but these are lucky side effects of the pursuit of maximizing profit, and not actually the goal that they were going for. In Mark Fisher's capitalist realism, which I discussed in my last video, Fisher explains that because of how ingrained capitalism is in our culture and even our minds, it may be difficult to imagine a world that isn't somehow capitalist anymore.
All born are bound to her. Should this world be unmade, so too shall her children.
Or, as early Margaret Thatcher was fond of saying, there is no alternative to capitalism. Others posit that capitalism has placed us at the end of history.
The world won't end today. But you will.
The end of history is a political and philosophical concept that supposes that a particular political, economic, or social system may develop that would constitute the endpoint of humanity's socio-cultural evolution and the final form of human government. But is capitalism really the best we can do?
The future is always a blank page.
Never tried to challenge destiny.
This could well be her last line of defense. It won't be easy. Let's go.
The Big Other seems to think so, at least for now, and at least according to Fisher, as he describes in his book.
The Big Other is the collective fiction, the symbolic structure, presupposed by any social field. The Big Other can never be encountered in itself, instead, we only ever confront its stand-ins. One important dimension of the Big Other is that it does not know everything. It is this constitutive ignorance of the big other that allows public relations to function. Indeed, the big other could be defined as the consumer of PR and propaganda, the virtual figure which is required to believe even when no individual can. To use one of Zizek's examples, who was it, for instance, who didn't know that really existing socialism, res, was shabby and corrupt? Not any of the people, who were all too aware of its shortcomings, nor any of the government administrators, who couldn't but know. No, it was the big other who was the one deemed not to know, who wasn't allowed to know, the quotidian reality of res. Yet the distinction between what the big other knows, i.e. what is officially accepted, and what is widely known and experienced by actual individuals, is very far from being merely emptily formal. It is the discrepancy between the two that allows ordinary social reality to function. When the illusion that the big other did not know can no longer be maintained, the incorporeal fabric holding the social system together disintegrates.
In our society, and here in America, our government, our big other, believes in capitalism and even neoliberalism. This creates a dangerous limitation presupposed in all political conversations. Bernie Sanders running for president showed us a good example of this, as news organizations said he couldn't win because he referred to himself as a democratic socialist. It wasn't that the people weren't interested in socialism. For most of the last decade, socialism has garnered more favorability in American polls than capitalism. So it must be the big other who couldn't stomach the talk of socialism, democratic or otherwise. Those of us fighting to make the general public more aware of modern monetary theory face a similar problem. Everyone in government, from their actions, seem to understand just how backwards their rhetoric is on US debt and deficit, and behave often as though they understand MMT when it benefits them politically, and disavow it when austerity serves their interests more.
I'm sure the knee-jerk response would be because it's expensive, and that's a fair assessment. But we do a lot of expensive things. Endless wars are expensive, healthcare is expensive, infrastructure is expensive, but we pay for all these things without batting an eye.
Their ability to do this hinges upon what the big other knows, and I would argue that we behave as though the big other is either ignorant or opposed to MMT. How can we fight such a large battle and convince a purely symbolic figure whom we can never confront that we're right? It's not as hard as it might sound, at least in theory, as Fisher explains.
This is why Khrushchev's speech in 1965, in which he admitted the failings of the Soviet state, was so momentous. It is not as if anyone in the party was unaware of the atrocities and corruption carried out in its name, but Khrushchev's announcement made it impossible to believe any more that the big other was ignorant of them.
Similarly, this means politicians don't have to be ignorant of MMT or favor unnecessary austerity programs or to limit what they think is possible in terms of pursuing their own goals. Instead, they simply have to think most are unaware of such a thing because the big other cannot be said to know. Breaking this barrier, turning to action, at least in theory, is pretty simple. Someone important, preferably from the establishment whom no one could easily call a radical, must publicly and vocally embrace MMT. Once a respected establishment figure has embraced and legitimized such an idea, it may be more difficult to claim things cannot be done with government spending, though I doubt even this will really pull Republicans' heads out of the sand. We came close to a moment like this with Bernie Sanders, who was advised by major MMTers, but when it came down to it, his idea of what is economically possible were a little too old-fashioned for him to really publicly embrace it. Plus, as I noted before, the mainstream media likes to consider him a radical, so that might diminish his effectiveness as well. Actually, the ideal person to break the silence on MMT is probably Joe Biden. I'm not saying he's likely to do so by any means, but if a moderate who has historically supported austerity and strict budgeting in Congress could support MMT, then perhaps with the right media coverage, this would create an event that could cause the big other to listen up and take notice. Overnight, all of our political opportunities could change.
The long, dark night of the end of history has to be grasped as an enormous opportunity. The very oppressive pervasiveness of capitalist realism means that even glimmers of alternative political and economic possibilities can have a disproportionately great effect. The tiniest event can tear a hole in the grey curtain of reaction which has marked the horizons of possibility under capitalist realism. From a situation in which nothing can happen, suddenly anything is possible again.
In a number of ways, the COVID crisis in the US in 2020 ended up showing us many of the small moments of a phenomena like this. In the Democratic primary for president in 2020, Andrew Yang's initial call for a universal basic income was unheard of because it was an idea that had had very few charismatic public-facing champions. The Big Other hadn't heard of it for sure. While he had a platform full of interesting and forward-thinking policy proposals that would make all the policy wonks swoon, his elevator pitch and his stump speech were all about the UBI. Because it was unheard of, it wasn't spoken of, and because no one had said the words before on the presidential debate stage, people thought it was impossible. A president might offer you some sort of income as a supplement to your own income.
Then we add in the possibility of massive layoffs caused by increased automation, and a cool idea becomes an imperative. What happens if self-driving trucks eliminate all the trucking jobs? That's 7.5 million people out of work, or roughly 6% of the entire US workforce. And trucking jobs aren't the only ones at risk. Agriculture, fast food, retail, even things like insurance underwriting, they're all ripe for a robot revolution.
One of the dynamics that is starting to be revealed here is the number of workers who are facing permanent job losses because their jobs have now been automated out of existence. New York Times has a good piece here, we can put this up. They're spotlighting toll workers on the Pennsylvania Turnpike who thought they had a pretty solid, pretty stable job, and when the pandemic hit, they were all laid off. They've brought in what they describe as labor-saving technology, which is sort of dystopian.
Your relationship to the government was supposed to be more of the opposite, with you paying them taxes instead of them giving you a dividend on the American wealth creation machine that you're a part of. Then the pandemic hit, and people as diverse as Bernie Sanders and Josh Hawley were calling for as much as $2,000 checks, while some plans had that payment recurring until the pandemic ends. As a part of the initial debate over how to deal with COVID on the national level, it was a bold minority proposal. It was unheard of, but they spoke it into being. Bernie shifted tactics to get a bonus of $2,400 a month added into the stimulus, leaving Hawley to vocally push for the direct payments. Meanwhile, Bernie stared down multiple powerful GOP senators threatening to derail the whole bill, and after a few tense days, he got his demands. Hawley wasn't as influential or effective, but the initial stimulus included direct payments to Americans on an unprecedented scale. This changed the realm of what it was possible for the government to do for its people. It had been clear the government wasn't scared to pump trillions of dollars of new money into the economy in a single year. 2008 and the resulting bailout showed us that. This was actually a great rebuke of neoliberal austerity. It wasn't that the money wasn't there, as they frequently told us, because when Wall Street had to pay up on its bad bets, the money flowed fast and furious. This incident showed us two important things very publicly. The banking sector and low-risk investments were built on a series of bets about things like housing prices, and that the whole thing could come tumbling down catastrophically. And when that happened, they bailed out Wall Street and prescribed more austere measures for Main Street. After all, they just spent all that money covering the losing bets of the richest Americans. The Big Other said, no money left.
Wall Street has been trying to raise awareness of this growing income gap, this growing opportunity and wealth between the richest people in America and the rest of us, the 99% they say. They're protesting inequality, lack of opportunity, a jobs market that's not working for everyone, too much student debt, and they feel like they've been sold a bill of goods, that they've taken out all the student debt for a place in an economy that's not giving them a job that's going to help them pay off that student debt. What they're protesting business as usual in Washington and business as usual on Wall Street. Both of those two big institutions, two big power structures in America that they think have conspired to make the wealthy wealthier and not serve the middle class.
Occupy Wall Street came and went, demanding a people's bailout. In 2016, Bernie Sanders' campaign rhetoric reflected this point. Main Street needed a bailout too. As Fisher puts it,
The war on terror has prepared us for such a development. The normalization of crisis produces a situation in which the repealing of measures brought in to deal with an emergency becomes unimaginable.
If 2008 normalized the idea that in a crisis the government could bail out America to the tune of trillions of dollars without much inflation, 2020 stimulus bill normalized the idea that we could be bailed out too. The idea of additional direct payments grew in popularity since, and it's nearly a year later and we've only seen an additional $600. Even though the former Republican president called for an immediate $2,000 check during his second campaign as a Hail Mary to help him get the edge in the November election. Democrats won an unlikely clean sweep in Georgia's second voting in January on calls for passing a $2,000 check in the months after November's Democratic presidential victory.
Mr. Vice President.
Mr. President.
That's right.
Biden said that passing a $2,000 check is a priority he wants to achieve by passing a $1,400 check, which, in addition to the previous administration's $600 check, would be $2,000. The problem with this logic is that it's a lot like the issues surrounding the minimum wage. After years of calling for an increase to a $15 living wage, the actual living wage is now above $20 an hour, so even passing a $15 minimum wage now wouldn't bring us to a current living wage. Likewise, with pandemic relief, and especially after Bernie's increases to unemployment insurance benefits wore off, debts have piled up for the record numbers of unemployed Americans a lot faster than a $1,200 to $2,000 check every 6 months can cover. For many unemployed Americans, the stimulus payments hardly covered a month's rent. The second $600 check wouldn't even cover a month's rent in most of America. Even at the time, this was brought back into the discussion just before the election, without a plan to follow it up like an emergency UBI. And $2,000 just wasn't enough then to pay for the back rent of Americans who were beginning to lose their homes. We need a bailout now more than ever, and recent polling shows direct payments are the number one demand for Americans, topping aid for small businesses and even vaccines. But just the idea that it is possible for us to ask for this was impossible for many to imagine in early 2019 before that series of events transpired.
The tiniest event can tear a hole in the grey curtain of reaction which has marked the horizons of possibility under capitalist realism. From a situation in which nothing can happen, suddenly anything is possible again.
What would be another similar public acceptance of failure for capitalism? Especially now, I think that the US healthcare industry is a great place to look. The more timely issue is one of who gets coverage at all. Barack Obama was the first mainstream high-profile politician to say the word single payer, descriptors that don't describe the Republican-influenced Obamacare that came to pass later. Bernie Sanders again was a part of the elevation of this idea in the mainstream. As I suggested before, he's not an ideal agent for influencing the big other because he's easily written off as a radical, and the big other is no radical. Nevertheless, Medicare for All became his signature issue, and over the years polling has found that it's become one of the most popular political ideas in American politics time and time again. Then in 2020, COVID stressed the limitations of Obamacare to their breaking point.
Never once did they contemplate the disruption, bankruptcy, and immorality of the current system. But now, unfortunately, all of those things are undeniably manifest for all to see. As millions upon millions lose their jobs, millions upon millions are also losing their health insurance, which is kind of inconvenient since we're in the middle of a pandemic. In fact, the employer-based healthcare system that Biden and many others are looking to maintain is crumbling before our very eyes. According to The Guardian, last year 160 million Americans were covered through their jobs. Now, a new study from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the Urban Institute found that up to 43 million Americans could lose that health insurance thanks to the mass layoffs that we are, of course, watching unfold in real time.
Of its many problems, the act tied a lot of healthcare to employment, and with COVID bringing record unemployment, this left many without healthcare in a crippling pandemic.
Some breaking news this morning. The unemployment numbers just came out for this week. Still a very troublingly high, with new claims at 860,000, with a decrease of 33,000 from last week. The data on here is always a little bit confusing because we kind of have two unemployment programs in this country. We have unemployment insurance on the state-by-state level. Then we have the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, which is the executive order signed by President Trump. If you take those two together, it's approximately 1.4 million that filed new unemployment claims last week. That's down from 1.7 million the week before, with a total number of 30 million Americans who are receiving some form of unemployment aid in the United States of America, approximately 1/10 of the entire country, and much higher percentage of the labor force right now.
Being out of work in a pandemic left them unable to afford to pay laughable COBRA rates to keep their previous and often basically unusable insurance, and that was the closest thing to a band-aid the system had in store for them. Despite Bernie Sanders gallantly keeping the issue in the mainstream, we found ourselves unable to pass a bill because of the unilateral power of people like Mitch McConnell. For now, with the aforementioned Georgia victories giving Kamala Harris the tiebreaker vote in the Senate and the Democrats a majority, we should at least be able to get emergency Medicare for all, right? Well, it looks like for now, no. The previous fight for even a single $1,400 direct payment seems to be hard enough for them right now. And the closest thing we have to a solution is a COBRA subsidy, which is about as much a solution as it is just the Biden administration propping up the health insurance industry with government money. Again. And we can do so much better. And thankfully, maybe soon we will. Fisher has his own issue with how capitalism interacts with the healthcare system, and that's how we treat and even think about mental illness.
If it is true, for instance, that depression is constituted by low serotonin levels, what still needs to be explained is why particular individuals have low levels of serotonin. This requires a social and political explanation, and the task of repoliticizing mental illness is an urgent one if the left wants to challenge capitalist realism. Instead of treating it as incumbent on individuals to resolve their own psychological distress, instead, that is, of accepting the vast privatization of stress that has taken place over the last 30 years, we need to ask, how has it become acceptable that so many people, and especially so many young people, are ill? The mental health plague in capitalist societies would suggest that, instead of being the only social system that works, capitalism is inherently dysfunctional, and that the cost of it appearing to work is very high.
Boy, oh boy. The price of freedom is steep. Embrace your dreams.
As the health industry is increasingly discovering, mental health may be more the fault of the capitalist mode of production than we've been led to believe.
How is it time to get up already? I'm not getting up. I have to get up. I have to go to work. I don't want to go to work. I hate work. I could call off, but that means actually picking up the phone and talking to someone. It's easier if I just don't show up. But then they'll call, and that'll make me anxious because I'll have to ignore it because I didn't go to work and I have no logical reason why I didn't go to work, and I can't lose another job because I didn't show up. I can't fuck this up. Guess I'll just go to work. Maybe today's the day I kill myself.
All this lines up with a recent shift in thinking, mainly related to addiction.
The Vietnam War. 20% of American troops in Vietnam were using a lot of heroin. People back home were really panicked because they thought there would be hundreds of thousands of junkies on the streets of the United States when the war was over. But a study followed the soldiers home and found something striking. They didn't go to rehab. They didn't even go into withdrawal. 95% of them just stopped after they got home. If you believe the old theory of addiction, that makes no sense. But if you believe Professor Alexander's theory, it makes perfect sense. Because if you're put into a horrific jungle in a foreign country where you don't want to be, and you could be forced to kill or die at any moment, doing heroin is a great way to spend your time. But if you go back to your nice home with your friends and your family, it's the equivalent of being taken out of that first cage and put into a human rat park. It's not the chemicals, it's your cage.
While the idea of a genetic basis for addiction still persists, recent evidence suggests that the cause driving us to addictive behaviors is dissatisfaction with our lives, and often our very material conditions. Is it any shock that the most economically depressed generations growing up in depression after recession and graduating into a weak job market with little opportunity to meaningfully advance or increasingly to maintain even a single job as a career, a generation where a side hustle isn't just a trend but the only way to tread water? Is it any shock that these generations lead the world in rates of clinical depression? And doesn't this add a lot of weight to the idea that the lack of serotonin isn't the cause of depression, but simply an organic reaction to our environment?
1 year ago, Gallup polling found record high optimism on how Americans view their personal finances. 59% of people at that time said they were better off than the previous year. Now, new polling reveals that optimism has plummeted. Now, just 35% of people say that they are better off than they were last year before the pandemic.
So, editor-in-chief at Gallup, Mohammed Yunus, he joins us now to unpack more of that data.
Those among whom we saw the most decline were among Republicans, which was not surprising, and I can explain why. But most concerning to me and our team was really among younger adult Americans. So 18 to 34-year-olds were among the most likely to have declined and said that their finances are definitely worse off this year than they were last year. These numbers also come at a time when overall satisfaction in the United States is at a record low. 11% of Americans right now are satisfied with the way things are going in the United States. One of the really important shifts among Republicans that we saw is when we ask about your satisfaction with the size and influence of major corporations in national life and government. In 2020, 57% of Republicans were satisfied with the role those corporations played. Today, 30% of Republicans, a drop of 26 percentage points, are satisfied.
7 seconds till the end. Time enough for you, perhaps. But what will you do with it? Let's see.
He'd tell you that he only cares about the planet, that he'd do everything in his power to protect and preserve it. But this isn't the way it's supposed to be. There's no greater threat to the planet than him.
Capitalism
Has to be stopped. He has to be. And that's why I'm asking you to help me. I know that together we can do this. But if we do, we'll be changing more than fate itself. If we succeed, if we win, we'll be changing ourselves. I guess maybe that's why I hesitated.
I shouldn't have to convince you that climate change is profit-driven. I also shouldn't have to convince you that energy sector lobbying, second only to war and health insurance, is a major corrupting influence in our government. So, it's easy to see how the principle of profit makes right fails our common resources, the environment itself. Maybe it's just an especially easy for me to understand. Where I live, the water is contaminated with a chemical called Gen X, which is a potentially dangerous chemical that Chemours has been pumping into the inland watershed for decades now, despite no idea of what it might be doing to us. I go out each week and buy about 8 gallons of water to drink and cook with because I know not to trust my own tap. But at least my water isn't full of lead, nor does it burst into flames, and I can still shower in it. This isn't so for a shocking amount of America.
I work in the oil fields out in North Dakota and just found something out about our tap water that we bathe in and use to brush our teeth and shit.
Experts say we've long passed the point of no return on climate change. The question is no longer if, but when and how bad. This is perhaps the most existential of capitalism's failures because it threatens nearly all life on Earth, including us humans. But as long as fossil fuels are cheaper than the clean alternatives, that's what the market, in all its infinite wisdom, will choose to power our cities. That decision is killing us, even now. The good news is that alternative energy is starting to match the price points of fossil fuels, and companies are beginning to add in environmental damage as an external cost, either willingly or through regulations like carbon taxes. This encourages them to do better by us, but it's simply too little too late. Imagine a socialist America of the 1950s. Instead of a Cold War over capitalism, in which we stacked up nuclear weapons enough to end the world many times over, we could have built out nuclear power plants. Nuclear power has a similar price point over 40 years of operation when compared to energy sources like coal, and it's been viable for decades. Other than public opinion, the main reason we didn't start greening the energy grid in the 1950s is capitalism. While they do well in the long term, nuclear plants require enormous upfront costs, more easily absorbed by the US government than private companies that don't have so much money that they can invest into a project that could take decades to build and even longer to break even. We missed that opportunity. But considering what we know about MMT, the opportunity is still present, and better late than never. Modern nuclear is much safer, more efficient, less expensive, especially when we're talking about modular concepts, and they can even recycle their own waste into fuel. Problem is that they're almost all just concepts. Few companies can afford to experiment with these concepts, and even less are willing. If we wait for the free market to embrace nuclear as an abundant, clean energy source ideal for supporting the intermittency of modern renewables, we may well wait until the end of the world to make any significant progress. There's a little more good news about our impact on the climate, though. This seems to be the one issue the Biden administration is interested in doing something about. President Biden has signed numerous climate change-related executive orders in his first week. While this is a step in the right direction, many of the efforts are being made to restore the pre-Trump status quo established by the previous Obama-Biden administration. Alone, those actions were insufficient then, and much like the need for direct payments, the longer we put them off, the more compounded our problems become, and the more urgent action is needed to correct them. There are some new actions by the administration that are encouraging, though, like the federal government's commitment to a completely electric fleet of vehicles. The effects of this go far beyond the sale of cars, though, because this will require a large amount of electric charging infrastructure to be built nationwide, making electric cars more viable for consumers in many new markets, likely leading the public to increasingly be able to follow suit and begin abandoning their internal combustion engines. This also provides massive cash injection to the electric vehicle market and all of its sub-markets like the batteries market. Not only will this investment create better electric cars and infrastructure over the next decade, it will also likely lead to advances in battery technology and grid storage options, which will be a necessity to be able to rapidly green the grid without a strong nuclear backbone to stabilize intermittency. I think the most important takeaway here is to dream big and outside the bounds of what the big other is aware of, because with exposure and legitimacy, even impossible ideas can become possible with time. I think the other is urgency. These are life and death problems, both immediate and existential, and we may well be waiting, and we may well die waiting for someone to step up and give a voice to them, or for capitalism to find a way to solve the problem while still making a return for investors.
be the first time I spit in Destiny's eye. Whether you can see the scenes or you can't, doesn't change that she's always trying to have it her way. Daddy's coming home real soon, honey.
If you are still watching the video at this point, I'd like to take the time to ask you to check out the following channels, which, like my own, have not reached 1,000 subscribers yet. And if you're not subscribed to this channel, hit that button, ring that bell, do the YouTube stuff. And in an effort to keep this channel ad-free into the future, I would also ask that if you appreciate the content I'm putting out here, that you could go over to my Patreon, or even for a one-time donation, my Ko-fi page, and send me a little bit of money to help me make ends meet in a year that has been troubling the hell out of everyone.